Hello tonight. You stand in a place where time no longer moves in a straight line, but drifts slowly like smoke rising from ancient embers. You step into a silence deeper than language, where even history feels unspoken. A question gently forms inside you. What remains when nothing is written, and memory must live only in human breath, repetition, and fragile remembering alone? You move deeper into a wide, open landscape where the ground feels like a soft, worn blanket beneath a pale gray sky. The air is calm and hesitant, as if even the wind chooses not to disturb anything. Small groups of people live far apart, shaped by slow seasons, simple farming, and quiet exchanges that feel more like gestures than trade. The horizon stretches endlessly, patient and unhurried, holding no urgency at all. A distant bird becomes the loudest news of the day carried across empty space. Somewhere nearby, a child laughs at something unseen, perhaps a goat acting too confidently, like a very modern problem in an ancient world. Everything is held together by memory, spoken and repeated around small fires. So, before you get completely comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel, but only if you truly enjoy what we're creating here. You are warmly invited to support this quiet journey through history, or to share it with someone who finds comfort in peaceful storytelling. If you'd like, leave a comment with where you are listening from and what time it is in your part of the world. Now slowly dim the lights, perhaps turn on a fan, letting the steady hum of the air fill the room. And in that gentle rhythm, we quietly step into tonight's journey together. The land continues to unfold around you like an unfinished memory, where communities remain, small enough that every face is familiar and every voice carries weight. You begin to notice that there are no formal rulers standing above the rest, only elders and storytellers who hold the fragile responsibility of remembering what came before. A shared truth exists, but it is shaped by repetition rather than written certainty. You feel amused imagining that gossip here might be the most powerful technology available. Around scattered hearths, stories become the structure that holds society together, passed from one evening to the next like carefully balanced stones. You realize that these oral traditions are not entertainment alone, but the backbone of identity itself. Each retelling adjusts slightly, like a melody played on different instruments. A man nearby insists he remembers the same tale perfectly, which feels relatable in a way that quietly resembles modern internet arguments about movie endings. You observe how relationships between groups depend on repeated narratives of kinship, exchange, and shared ancestry. Marriage ties and seasonal gatherings strengthen this network of spoken memory. Without written records, trust becomes something heard rather than seen. You imagine how easily a story might drift over generations, like a river slowly changing its path. It makes you smile softly to think that even ancient memory might have suffered from telephone game errors. In this world, time itself feels circular rather than linear, as stories return each season in slightly adjusted forms. You sense how identity is maintained, not through documents, but through collective agreement reinforced by ritual. A ceremonial gathering takes place in the distance, and the rhythm of drums feels like punctuation for history. Someone nearby jokingly complains that remembering everything without notes must be the original full-time job with no vacation days. You begin to understand that before writing existed, societies depended on trained memory specialists, individuals whose minds functioned like living archives. Historical evidence from early Mesopotamian and Egyptian contexts later confirms such roles existed, where certain people were entrusted with preserving complex knowledge through speech alone. You imagine the quiet pressure of never being allowed to forget anything important, which feels like a very intense form of responsibility. The landscape remains peaceful, yet beneath that calm surface you sense something delicate, as if the entire structure of society could shift if a single story were altered too much. You watch how children learn by repetition, repeating phrases until they become natural, almost like breathing. A small, humorous thought crosses your mind. Forgetting an important story here might be the ancient equivalent of losing your phone, with no backup. As the day moves forward, light shifts gently across the fields, marking time without urgency. Field work follows the rhythm of memory rather than written schedules. People rely on inherited knowledge of seasons, soil, and exchange. Without written instructions, every task is learned through lived experience, giving daily life a slower, more organic, and deeply human flow. You see, communal life depends on repeated storytelling, where small variations are accepted as natural. Memory drift. No one demands perfect precision, only continuity. Truth is shared, not fixed. An elder jokes that forgetting a harvest date once is fine, but twice makes you historically unreliable, a phrase that feels surprisingly modern. In this ancient, slow-moving world, you begin to feel how fragile yet resilient this system is, like woven grass bending without breaking. Its strength comes from repetition and shared presence. Without written authority, knowledge stays alive through human voices. History feels breathed rather than stored, as if the past exists only because people continue speaking it gently into the quiet air. Even the environment joins this memory system, where rivers and trees become markers of shared stories. Seasons guide understanding more than maps ever could. A traveler jokes that getting lost is simply choosing a new memory path, a thought that feels almost philosophical in its simplicity and strangely comforting in this slow world. You notice there is no central archive, no permanent record of decisions or agreements. Everything rests on trust in human memory, creating both intimacy and quiet vulnerability. Each person becomes a living vessel of shared history, where forgetting is not personal failure but a collective risk. As evening falls, light softens across fields, and small gatherings form around slow, steady fires. Stories return not as entertainment, but as gentle reinforcement of shared understanding. A storyteller pauses, and someone nearby offers a joking correction, like an ancient version of comment sections. Firelight flickers, and the line between past and present grows softer. Each voice layers memory into identity through repetition and change. You begin to feel remembering and forgetting, moving together like a single slow breath of history. You begin to notice that this world does not organize itself through written law but through the quiet authority of those who remember best. Storytellers, priests, and memory keepers stand at the center of communal life, not as rulers in a formal sense, but as living bridges between past and present. Their voices carry weight not because they are loud, but because they are trusted. In small gatherings, you observe how stories are not simply told, but carefully shaped, like soft clay formed by repeated hands. Each retelling strengthens certain details while gently smoothing others. There is no official record to compare against, only the shared agreement of those listening. It feels strangely stable, like a balance maintained by collective belief, rather than written certainty. You realize that power here does not announce itself with symbols or laws carved into stone. Instead, it lives inside memory, inside the ability to recall events accurately enough that others accept them as truth. A storyteller becomes influential not by force, but by consistency. It is a quiet kind of authority, one that depends entirely on trust and repetition. The community itself feels tightly woven through shared narratives. Every family connection, every alliance, and every disagreement is anchored in remembered events. You notice how people often begin sentences with "as we remember" rather than "as it is written." It gives conversations a fluid quality, as if truth itself is something gently shaped by presence rather than preserved in ink. You pass a gathering where elders resolve a seasonal dispute through shared recollection instead of written records. Each person contributes a fragment of memory, slowly shaping a collective understanding. The process feels informal, yet it carries enough weight for everyone to accept the outcome. There is no strict debate, only gentle comparison of remembered details, as if truth is assembled rather than declared. You find it quietly amusing that even disagreement here resembles collaborative storytelling more than conflict, where memory is adjusted together until it feels balanced and complete. The strength of this system lies in connection. Shared memory binds people together more tightly than any written rule might. When everyone participates in remembering, everyone also participates in preserving identity. Yet you sense a subtle fragility beneath it all, as if a single distorted story, repeated enough times, could gently reshape what a community believes about itself. A nearby conversation reveals how flexible truth can become when it depends entirely on human recall. Someone insists a certain event happened during one harvest season, while another confidently places it in the next. Neither side produces evidence, only conviction. The discussion ends not with resolution, but with agreement to continue the story in a way that preserves harmony. You begin to see how relationships between neighboring groups are maintained through narrative exchange. Stories of shared ancestry, trade, and ritual act as social glue. Marriages often reinforce these bonds, weaving families together across distances. It feels like society itself is built from overlapping circles of memory, each one reinforcing the others like layers of soft fabric. Despite the warmth of connection, there is an underlying vulnerability. Without written records, memory can shift slowly over time, almost unnoticed. You think of it like sand being gently reshaped by wind. No single moment feels like a change, yet over generations, the landscape of truth can look subtly different, even while everyone believes it remains the same. You recall historical evidence from early Mesopotamian and Egyptian societies, where specialized individuals were trained to preserve complex information through oral and ritualized memory systems. These memory keepers were essential for maintaining continuity in trade, religion, and governance before widespread writing systems emerged. It strikes you how deeply civilization once depended on human recall alone. In this world, knowledge does not sit still. It moves from person to person like a shared breath. You notice how even children are taught through repetition rather than instruction manuals. Learning becomes an act of listening and repeating, rather than reading and referencing. It gives education a softer rhythm, almost musical in its consistency. You pass by a group preparing for a seasonal ritual where spoken tradition guides every step. There are no written guides, only inherited patterns passed down through memory. The participants move with practiced familiarity, as if the past itself is gently guiding their actions. A small humorous moment arises when someone forgets a step and quietly follows a neighbor. As you observe more closely, you realize that memory here is not treated as fragile but as something actively maintained. People repeat important stories regularly, not out of boredom, but out of necessity. It is a form of collective maintenance, like tending a shared garden that must be cared for continuously, or it slowly changes shape. Even disagreements about the past feel less like conflict and more like negotiation. You watch as people adjust details slightly to preserve harmony, prioritizing continuity over precision. There is an unspoken understanding that the goal is not perfect accuracy, but a shared version of events that allows the community to move forward together without fracture. You start to sense how influence grows quietly in such a system. Those who remember well or speak persuasively naturally gain authority. Yet this authority remains fragile, always dependent on the agreement of listeners. If belief shifts, power shifts with it. It feels like watching leadership emerge not from force but from sustained attention and collective acceptance. The environment itself seems to support this memory-based society. Landmarks, rivers, and seasonal cycles act as natural anchors for storytelling. People reference the land as if it participates in memory. You find it poetic that geography becomes a kind of living archive, silently reinforcing the stories people tell about where they come from and who they believe they are. As the day settles, You notice how stories continue to circulate even in quiet moments. There is no separation between history and daily life. Everything is part of one continuous narrative. You begin to understand that in this world, identity is not recorded but performed and repeated like a soft. You leave this chapter with the sense that stability here is not built on fixed records but on living agreement. The guardians of memory hold society together not through control, but through continuity. Yet beneath that calm surface you recognize how easily stories might shift over time, slowly reshaping the world without anyone noticing the moment it begins. You notice a subtle change in how people begin to handle information, as if memory itself is slowly learning a new shape. Instead of relying only on spoken repetition, small marks appear on clay, wood, and stone. These early symbols do not yet feel like full language, but they carry intention, like footprints left deliberately to guide those who come after. In busy gathering spaces, you see individuals carefully pressing signs into soft surfaces, repeating patterns that represent goods, names, or exchanges. The act feels deliberate and quiet, almost ceremonial. People watch these markings with a mixture of curiosity and respect, as if they are witnessing something that might one day replace spoken memory without fully understanding what that means yet. You begin to sense a shift in authority, moving gently away from those who remember stories toward those who can record them. The rememberers still hold respect, but the writers now hold something new: permanence. It is not loud or dramatic, but it changes how people listen, as written marks do not forget, even when voices do. The world around you feels slightly more structured, as if invisible lines are being drawn between information and interpretation. Written symbols allow details to remain unchanged across time, reducing the natural drift of oral storytelling. Yet this stability also creates distance, because memory no longer needs to live inside every person, only within selected records. You observe how growing populations increase the pressure to manage information more efficiently. Trade, food distribution, and social agreements require clarity beyond memory alone. What once depended on trust between individuals now begins to depend on systems of recording. It feels like society is quietly building a second layer of memory beneath the first. In one settlement, you watch as records are stored carefully, not as personal stories but as functional data. These marks are not meant to entertain or inspire, but to ensure consistency. A small humorous thought crosses your mind that even ancient bureaucracy might have started with someone trying to remember who owed how many jars of grain. Historical evidence confirms this shift, especially with the emergence of cuneiform writing in ancient Sumer around 3200 BCE. You picture early scribes carefully pressing wedge-shaped marks into soft clay tablets, working slowly under natural light. Each symbol begins as a practical solution for trade and administration, yet already carries the quiet potential to reshape how human memory is preserved over time. These early records are not created with grand intention, but with simple necessity, documenting grain, goods, and transactions. Yet as they accumulate, they begin to transform the nature of truth itself. You sense how something once flexible and spoken becomes fixed in clay, gaining permanence. Over time, these practical marks evolve into a system that defines how reality is recorded and understood. As writing becomes more common, those who understand symbols begin to hold a new kind of influence. Literacy is not widespread, so knowledge of writing creates a natural boundary between specialists and the broader community. You notice how authority starts to align with interpretation of symbols rather than oral mastery alone. You sense that this change is not sudden, but gradual, like a river slowly altering its course over time. People do not abandon spoken memory, instead they begin to supplement it with written records. The two systems coexist for a while, creating a layered reality where truth is both spoken and stored. In daily life, you observe how written records begin to stabilize agreements that once depended on collective recollection. Transactions become more precise, and disputes rely less on memory alone. There is a quiet comfort in this consistency, but also a subtle shift in trust, as people begin to rely on objects rather than shared human recall. You pass by individuals carefully guarding clay tablets, treating them as valuable assets. These objects are not decorative but functional anchors of memory. It feels almost poetic that knowledge has begun to take physical form, as if thoughts themselves have learned how to rest outside the human mind. The presence of writing introduces a new kind of permanence that oral tradition cannot easily match. While spoken stories can adapt and breathe, written symbols remain fixed. You begin to see how this stability may protect accuracy but also limit flexibility, locking certain versions of truth into place. You notice that communities start to rely on written records for taxation, resource allocation, and administrative decisions. This creates efficiency, but also centralization. Information now flows through designated points rather than through every voice equally. It feels like memory is slowly becoming organized into channels rather than open fields. A quiet tension emerges between tradition and record. Some people still prefer oral storytelling, trusting the warmth of shared memory, while others embrace written systems for their clarity. You sense that neither side fully replaces the other yet, but the balance is beginning to tilt in favor of written authority. Even in casual conversations, people occasionally reference written marks as proof of events. This changes the tone of discussion, as memory alone is no longer always sufficient. You find it slightly amusing that truth is beginning to require physical evidence, as if memory itself has started carrying identification papers. You realize that writing does not eliminate memory but reshapes it. Instead of being stored entirely within people, parts of it now exist externally. This creates a shared cognitive environment where human recollection and written record interact continuously, each influencing how the other is understood and trusted. As the system expands, written language begins to shape not only administration, but also identity itself. Communities start defining who they are through records, lists, and inscriptions. Memory becomes increasingly structured, less fluid, as society learns to view itself through organized documentation rather than shifting oral tradition. This change subtly alters perception, as belonging is now confirmed through written traces, rather than shared recollection. Identity feels more fixed, yet also more externalized. You sense how people begin to understand themselves through what is recorded about them, rather than only what is collectively remembered. You feel the turning point clearly now. When memory can be written, it can also be shaped, edited, and preserved selectively. The flow of history becomes more directed, less spontaneous, and as you move forward, you sense that this new form of organized voice is only the beginning of a deeper transformation in how truth itself will be controlled. You begin to see how writing is no longer just a tool for memory, but something that quietly organizes entire societies. Records are used to track goods, labor, and obligations, turning invisible agreements into visible marks. What once lived only in speech now exists in fixed form, creating a sense of order that feels both reassuring and slightly unfamiliar. In growing settlements, central trade areas slowly become centers of information. Markets are no longer only spaces of exchange, but also places where records are created and maintained. Every transaction leaves a trace behind, and the act of recording becomes as important as the exchange itself in shaping organized economic life. Those who manage these records begin to gain a quiet but steadily growing influence over daily activity. Their role is not based on force but on control of information that others rely on. You notice how authority gradually shifts toward individuals who handle documentation, shaping decisions through the preservation and organization of written traces. As commerce expands, the need for accuracy becomes more important than ever. Grain, livestock, and crafted goods must be counted with care, because even small errors can ripple through entire communities. You realize that writing is not only about preserving memory, but about preventing uncertainty in systems that are becoming increasingly complex. With time, you sense that boundaries are forming not only on land, but also in information. What is recorded and what is not recorded begins to matter deeply. Information itself becomes something that can be controlled, and control over records starts to resemble control over resources, shaping how societies define fairness and access. Historical evidence from ancient Uruk shows early clay tablets recording exchanges of barley and beer, revealing how closely writing was tied to economic life. You imagine scribes carefully pressing symbols into soft clay, unaware they are forming one of humanity's earliest administrative systems, where even simple goods are transformed into permanent records, shaping organized society. These early records show how writing grows from practical necessity rather than abstract intention. Each mark represents labor, goods, and exchange, gradually building a structured view of daily life. You sense how ordinary transactions become part of a larger system, where written symbols quietly extend memory beyond the limits of individual recall. As these systems expand, a new group of specialists begins to emerge, dedicated to writing and maintaining records. They are not traditional rulers, yet their expertise grants them a unique position within society. You notice how knowledge of symbols gradually becomes a form of quiet authority, shaping decisions through access to preserved information. Influence slowly shifts toward those who can interpret, organize, and preserve written knowledge. This creates a new structural layer within society where administrative skill becomes increasingly important. You begin to see how writing does not only record civilization, but also subtly reorganizes its internal balance of power over time. In this evolving world, power does not always announce itself loudly. Instead, it appears through control of documentation, lists, and records. Those who manage information begin to shape how decisions are made, even without direct force. It feels like authority is slowly learning to speak through paper and clay, instead of voice alone. You observe how communities begin to trust records more than memory. Written accounts are seen as more stable, less likely to change over time. This shift feels gradual, almost natural, yet it changes how people resolve disputes and organize responsibilities, reducing reliance on personal recollection. Even in quiet spaces, you notice the presence of recorded information shaping behavior. People act with awareness that their actions may be documented. This awareness introduces a new kind of discipline, where visibility through records influences choices, even when no one is directly watching. You begin to understand that record-keeping is not neutral. It selects what is preserved and what is forgotten. Every system of documentation carries choices within it, shaping collective understanding of events. This selective preservation becomes a quiet but powerful force within society. Markets continue to thrive, but now they operate alongside administrative systems that track flows of goods. You see how efficiency increases, yet also how dependence on written systems grows. The simplicity of oral agreement slowly gives way to structured documentation that leaves less room for ambiguity. In one corner of a trading area, you imagine a scribe carefully updating tallies of grain and brewed beverages. These records are not just notes, but tools of coordination that allow larger populations to function together. A small humorous thought arises that ancient accounting might have been humanity's first attempt at organized stress management. Over time, those who control records become essential to governance. Their role is not glamorous, but it is indispensable to the functioning of society. You sense authority quietly shifting toward administrative skill, where understanding symbols and written systems begins to matter as much as physical strength, family lineage, or traditional forms of spoken influence. The environment feels calmer, yet more structured, as if invisible lines of order are being drawn through everyday life. Written records bring stability and consistency, reducing uncertainty in communication and decisions. However, you also notice a trade-off as systems become more predictable, but less flexible than earlier oral traditions that allowed adaptation through memory and conversation. You realize that control over information begins to resemble control over reality itself. What is recorded gains permanence and authority, while what is not recorded gradually fades from collective awareness. This creates a subtle imbalance between lived experience and documented history, where memory outside written form becomes less visible over time. As you move through this world, writing is no longer an external tool but an integrated part of social structure. Every transaction, decision, and obligation passes through written systems that quietly organize society. You begin to see how deeply record-keeping shapes daily life, embedding itself into both governance and personal interaction. This transformation feels structural rather than accidental. As societies grow larger and more complex, writing becomes essential for coordination and survival. Yet within this efficiency lies a quiet shift in power, where authority gradually moves away from those who remember toward systems that store, organize, and define memory itself. And as the chapter gently closes, you sense the deeper truth forming beneath everything you have observed. When record-keeping becomes essential, society does not just organize itself more efficiently, it begins to change from within, reshaping the very nature of power, memory, and trust. You begin to notice that writing no longer belongs only to trade or administration, but slowly extends into deeper structures of belief and meaning. Religious rituals, legal codes, and commercial agreements are increasingly recorded, giving them permanence that spoken tradition alone could never fully achieve. Written form begins to feel like a quiet extension of reality itself. As records expand into sacred and civic life, older stories gradually shift into more unified versions. Local interpretations begin to converge into standardized narratives that feel increasingly consistent across regions. You observe that this change does not arrive suddenly, but rather through a slow smoothing of differences that happens almost unnoticed over time. There are no clear moments of conflict or resistance marking this transformation. Instead, change occurs through repetition and documentation. What is written becomes what is repeated, and what is repeated slowly becomes accepted as the most reliable version of reality. You sense how authority begins to emerge from consistency, rather than force. Communities gradually adjust to this new structure of truth without deliberate awareness. Older oral traditions still exist, but they begin to lose their central position in defining shared understanding. Written accounts are referenced more frequently, shaping perception through steady repetition rather than direct imposition or visible control. Over time, written authority becomes embedded in everyday life, guiding how people interpret both past and present. You begin to see how documentation does not simply record reality, but quietly organizes it. Through repetition and acceptance, writing transforms from a tool of memory into a foundation of perceived truth. Communities begin to adapt naturally to official versions of truth. Older stories are not fully forgotten, but they are referenced less often than written accounts. Over time, the documented version gains a subtle authority that shapes collective understanding without needing enforcement, quietly guiding how people interpret shared history. Historical evidence from ancient Egypt shows how record-keeping was used not only for administration, but also to reinforce and legitimize the authority of the pharaoh. Inscriptions carved into stone and carefully preserved official texts created a continuous narrative of divine rule. You begin to see how governance and written documentation were tightly interwoven, shaping how authority was publicly understood. These inscriptions were more than simple records. They functioned as declarations that transformed political structure into sacred continuity. You imagine vast stone surfaces covered in carefully carved symbols, each one asserting legitimacy across generations. Over time, written narrative and religious belief merge, allowing rulers to appear not only as political leaders, but as divinely anchored figures within recorded history itself. As this system deepens, collective memory gradually shifts into the hands of those who control writing. Recording is no longer neutral because it determines which versions of events are preserved and which fade. Memory becomes increasingly structured through written frameworks that quietly filter what remains visible over time. You begin to feel as if reality itself is being gently edited, not all at once but gradually, page by page. Each record adds stability while narrowing variation. The world feels like a manuscript under slow revision, where earlier versions still exist beneath the surface but are increasingly less visible in daily life. In everyday experience, people adjust to this evolving relationship with truth. Documents, inscriptions, and written records become common references in discussions of events. Oral memory still exists, but it begins to feel secondary, as though it must now align with written confirmation in order to be fully accepted. This shift changes not only information but perception itself. What is considered real increasingly depends on what has been documented. You notice a subtle alignment forming between written authority and social belief, shaping how truth is recognized and shared across communities. In religious contexts, sacred texts begin to define ritual practice with greater consistency. Variations that once existed between regions slowly diminish as written forms standardize belief. You sense how writing organizes not only society, but also spiritual experience, giving structure to faith itself. Trade and governance become more unified through recorded systems. Agreements that were once flexible now follow structured written formats. This brings clarity and predictability but also reduces the adaptability that oral negotiation once allowed, tightening the boundaries of social exchange. People rarely perceive this transformation as dramatic. Instead, it feels natural and inevitable, unfolding gradually through everyday use. The written word does not announce its influence. It simply accumulates authority through repetition, consistency, and quiet acceptance over time. In administrative centers, scribes and record keepers steadily gain greater responsibility as written systems expand. Their role is not to invent stories, but to preserve official versions of events with careful accuracy. Yet in doing so, they inevitably shape which details remain visible in collective understanding and which gradually fade from shared awareness over time. Memory slowly becomes less a free-flowing communal experience and more a structured process filtered through documentation. This filtering defines what is remembered at scale, across regions and generations. You begin to sense a subtle restructuring of reality itself, where written forms quietly establish the boundaries of collective recall and determine what society continues to recognize as important. The environment around you feels calm, yet newly structured, as if invisible frameworks are guiding daily life without direct notice. Written authority introduces order and predictability into complex systems, but it also places layers between lived experience and recorded truth. You start to understand how deeply this separation shapes perception and influences how people interpret their own reality. As you observe more closely, you realize that rewriting reality does not require force or visible control. Instead, it unfolds through alignment, convenience, and repetition over time. Once written systems are widely accepted, they naturally guide how stories are told, preserved, and gradually transformed into stable, accepted versions of history, shared across society. You begin to see the broader pattern beneath these gradual changes. Writing does not only preserve civilization, it actively participates in shaping it. By determining what is recorded, it also influences what becomes important, slowly guiding collective understanding in subtle and continuous directions that feel natural rather than imposed or directed. And as this chapter gently settles into stillness, you feel the core transformation beneath everything you have observed. When stories become written and standardized, reality begins to align itself with the structure of the written word. and power quietly shifts toward those who hold the authority to record, preserve, and define what is remembered. You begin to see a world where memory is no longer something shared equally among voices, but something carefully organized within systems. Between roughly 3000 and 2000 BCE, administrative structures become more complete and stable, allowing written records to extend far beyond trade or storytelling into the core of governance itself. Within this developing order, societies begin to rely less on fluid oral memory and more on structured documentation. You observe how written records gradually define continuity over time, shaping not only administration but also how entire civilizations understand their own stability and long-term identity. As these systems develop, the old authority of oral tradition gradually loses its central position. Storytellers and memory keepers still exist, but their influence is no longer absolute or defining. You notice how spoken knowledge begins to feel secondary, while written documentation slowly takes the lead in determining what is considered reliable, stable, and worthy of preservation across generations. In this emerging structure, those who control written records become increasingly important within society. Scribes, administrators, and record keepers are no longer background figures but essential participants in governance. Their access to information places them close to decision-making processes, especially as societies grow larger, more complex, and increasingly dependent on organized systems of documentation. There is no single moment where power is taken away from oral tradition. Instead, you realize it unfolds without spectacle or confrontation, as a gradual reconfiguration of social structure. Authority slowly shifts toward those who manage information, like architecture being rebuilt quietly while daily life continues without interruption or visible disruption around it. Historical evidence from the Library of Ashurbanipal shows how ancient societies began collecting and preserving written knowledge on a large scale. Tablets stored there include law, literature, and administrative records. You imagine rooms filled with clay documents, each one contributing to a long-term effort to organize memory across generations and maintain continuity of recorded knowledge. As writing becomes central, religious and legal systems begin to stabilize. Through written forms, rituals and laws that once varied between regions are gradually recorded and standardized. You observe how written language begins to define not only governance, but also belief systems and moral frameworks that shape how communities interpret order and meaning. At this stage, memory is no longer only a human function distributed across individuals and communities. It becomes part of an organized system that exists beyond any single person, operating with its own structure and continuity. You start to feel that remembering is no longer simply something people do in daily life, but something institutions now manage, organize, and preserve carefully over extended periods of time. The shift is subtle, but profoundly transformative in its long-term effects. Collective memory, once shaped by shared storytelling and variation, becomes increasingly structured through documentation. You notice how written systems do not erase oral tradition entirely, but gradually define its boundaries, influencing what is preserved and what slowly fades away. In everyday life, this transformation appears practical rather than ideological or imposed. Written records gradually improve administration, reduce uncertainty, and help manage growing populations with greater efficiency. You observe how daily systems become more organized, not through sudden disruption, but through steady integration of documentation into ordinary processes that quietly support coordination across expanding communities over time. People adapt naturally to this system because it enhances coordination and stability, rather than through sudden or visible pressure. Written records become part of routine life, shaping how agreements are made and maintained. You notice how acceptance grows gradually, as documentation proves useful in reducing confusion and aligning actions, allowing society to function with greater consistency and shared understanding. You observe how authority becomes closely tied to access to written knowledge and documentation over time. Individuals who can read and write gain a natural advantage in navigating increasingly complex systems of governance and administration. This creates a quiet concentration of influence around administrative centers, where records are created, stored, interpreted, and continuously maintained as the foundation of organized society. Even cultural memory begins to shift under this influence. Stories that once existed in multiple versions are gradually aligned toward official narratives preserved in writing. You sense how variation slowly decreases, replaced by standardized accounts that carry institutional authority and shape collective understanding across different regions and communities. The environment of society feels more structured, almost like a vast network of recorded agreements and documented interactions. Every major action seems to pass through written confirmation. You notice how this creates stability and predictability, while also introducing distance between lived experience and the systems that now define and preserve it over time. You begin to see how law, once flexible and locally interpreted, becomes increasingly uniform through written codes and standardized rules. This reduces ambiguity and conflict, but also limits the adaptability that oral systems once allowed. Everything becomes more consistent but also less personal and less responsive to immediate context. Religious practices also begin to align more closely with written tradition and sacred texts. Rituals are recorded and preserved, helping unify belief systems across regions. You realize how writing is not only organizing administration, but also shaping how people understand the divine, morality, and the structure of spiritual experience itself. In this new order, memory itself is no longer purely communal or locally shared. It is distributed through institutions that store, organize, and regulate information over time. You feel a subtle shift in meaning, where remembering becomes not only an individual act, but also an institutional function embedded within structured systems. You begin to understand that this transformation does not eliminate human memory, but instead repositions it within a larger framework. People still remember, but their memories are increasingly guided, supported, and sometimes corrected by written records that carry greater authority and long-term stability across generations. There is a quiet realization that society has reached a turning point where information no longer belongs entirely to the community. Instead, it becomes something that can be collected, organized, and maintained independently of individual recollection. You sense how this separation fundamentally changes the relationship between people and their shared past. As you move through this chapter, you begin to see the underlying pattern with increasing clarity. When memory becomes centralized through writing, it transforms into authority. And when authority is tied to recorded memory, society gradually adapts not only to what is remembered, but also to what is officially preserved and recognized as truth. You begin to observe how daily life gradually settles into a world fully surrounded by written order. People no longer live only within spoken agreements or remembered promises. Instead, laws, taxes, and transactions are carefully recorded, shaping a structured environment where every action leaves a trace within an expanding system of documentation that slowly defines how society understands continuity. In markets and settlements, exchanges are no longer fleeting moments between individuals. Each trade is written down, each obligation recorded with quiet precision and care. You notice how this creates a new rhythm of life, where even ordinary interactions carry the expectation that they may later be reviewed, verified, or compared through written evidence preserved over time. As time passes, people slowly become accustomed to the idea of being recorded. Their actions, agreements, and responsibilities exist not only in memory, but in permanent form. You sense that this changes behavior subtly, as individuals begin to act with awareness that their lives are now part of an enduring system of records that continues beyond them. Despite these changes, life continues in familiar ways. People still farm, trade, gather, and celebrate together in seasonal cycles. The difference is not in what they do, but in how those actions are preserved afterward. Reality itself feels doubled, existing both in lived experience and in written documentation that quietly follows behind every event. Historical records from ancient Babylon reveal highly detailed tax systems, where agricultural output, goods, and labor were meticulously tracked. You imagine scribes carefully maintaining clay tablets filled with numbers and categories, forming one of the earliest large-scale administrative frameworks in human history, linking economic activity with a permanent written structure that organizes collective production and distribution. These systems show how writing gradually becomes essential to managing complexity in growing societies. Every resource, transaction, and obligation is carefully recorded for reference and accountability. You begin to see how administration extends beyond simple record-keeping, evolving into a structured method of coordinating economic life across regions through standardized documentation and consistent written procedures. Within this structured environment, written systems begin to define stability in increasingly important ways. Disputes are resolved through records rather than memory, and agreements gain strength through documented evidence. You notice how written confirmation gradually replaces oral testimony, creating a more predictable framework for resolving conflict and maintaining order across communities. This shift also increases dependence on those who manage and interpret written information. Scribes and administrators become essential intermediaries within society, guiding how records are understood and applied. You sense how authority slowly concentrates around access to documentation, as control over written knowledge becomes central to governance and decision-making processes. Not everyone adapts easily to this new reality of recorded life. Some individuals and groups choose to leave settled regions, moving away from areas where documentation and record-keeping are strict. You understand this as an early form of resistance, a quiet attempt to preserve a way of living less defined by permanent written traces. Yet for most people, adaptation becomes natural over time, almost effortless in its gradual development. Living within a recorded system becomes normal, even invisible in daily experience. You begin to see how deeply written order integrates into society until it no longer feels external, but instead becomes part of the surrounding environment itself. The concept of identity also begins to shift under this expanding system of records. People are no longer known only through memory and reputation within communities. Instead, they are increasingly defined through documents that record obligations, contributions, and social standing, creating a layered sense of identity, both personal and administrative. In administrative centers, the accumulation of records grows steadily and continuously. Clay tablets, inscriptions, and written lists form expanding archives of collective activity and organization. You imagine entire rooms filled with carefully ordered memory, each artifact representing a fragment of economic and social life preserved across time with deliberate structure. This creates what feels like a structured collective memory, where society remembers itself through documentation rather than solely through oral tradition. You sense that memory is no longer evenly distributed among individuals but concentrated within systems designed to store, organize, and retrieve information across generations and administrative boundaries. Even personal relationships begin to be influenced by this expanding structure of written order. Agreements between families, marriages, and partnerships may be documented, giving them a formal dimension beyond spoken commitment. You notice how writing gradually enters spaces that were once informal, reshaping how trust and obligation are understood. The presence of written order introduces a quiet form of predictability into daily life. People begin to trust systems of record more than individual recollection or personal testimony. You observe how this growing trust gradually changes the texture of society, making interactions more stable and reliable, yet increasingly dependent on external verification systems that exist beyond human memory. At the same time, you sense a subtle emotional distance forming between lived experience and stored memory. When events are recorded outside the human mind, they become less fluid and less adaptable over time. Experiences are preserved with greater accuracy, yet they also become fixed in ways that can feel less personal than spoken remembrance shared directly between people. This shift alters how truth is perceived within everyday life. What is documented begins to carry more weight than what is simply remembered or retold. You notice how conversations increasingly reference written confirmation, as if memory itself now requires validation through external systems in order to be fully accepted. Within social understanding, you notice how administration becomes essential for maintaining this expanding system of recorded life. Scribes and record keepers ensure that information flows correctly across time, regions, and communities. Their work remains quiet and methodical, yet it forms the foundational structure that holds together increasingly large and interconnected populations relying on consistent documentation. In this written order, society begins to resemble a carefully organized archive of itself. Every action has the potential to become a record, and every record contributes to a larger framework of collective understanding. You feel as though you are moving through a world that remembers continuously, without interruption, where forgetting is gradually replaced by structured preservation. As this chapter unfolds, you begin to understand the deeper transformation taking place across society. When written systems become stable and widespread, they are no longer just tools for organization. Instead, society begins to live inside them, gradually adapting itself to the quiet architecture of recorded memory that shapes its reality. You begin to see how written systems no longer exist as isolated tools within small communities but expand across entire territories. Administrative structures grow more complex and interconnected, reaching distant regions through carefully maintained records that travel beyond immediate human memory or local agreement. What once depended on memory and face-to-face understanding now operates through standardized written systems that stretch across space and time. You notice how coordination increasingly relies on documentation, allowing large and growing populations to function within shared frameworks that remain consistent even when individuals are separated by distance and changing circumstances. As these systems expand, law becomes increasingly unified across different regions. Areas that once followed distinct local customs gradually begin to align under shared written codes. You notice how this creates a sense of coherence across large populations, as legal decisions are no longer based on memory or interpretation alone, but on documented rules that remain consistent. Taxation and trade are also transformed by this expanding written structure. Goods, services, and obligations are tracked through official records, allowing authorities to manage resources with greater precision. You observe how writing becomes the foundation for coordination at scale, enabling societies to function beyond the natural limits of individual and collective memory. Historical evidence from the Code of Hammurabi, dating to around 1754 BCE, shows one of the earliest known examples of written legal systems. You imagine engraved stone columns standing in public spaces, carefully inscribed with detailed laws intended for public viewing. These records represent a shift toward structured governance, where justice is recorded in permanent form, rather than passed through oral tradition. On these stone monuments, laws are presented as fixed and visible rules that apply consistently across society. You sense how this transforms justice into something stable and enduring, rather than flexible or locally interpreted through spoken negotiation. Written law begins to define authority itself, creating a system where order is maintained through permanent documentation rather than shifting human memory or oral agreement. With these developments, power becomes more stable and enduring over long periods of time. Written records allow rulers and institutions to maintain continuity across generations, even in their absence. You sense how authority becomes less dependent on individual presence and more dependent on systems that preserve, organize, and transmit information consistently. However, this stability comes with a subtle but important cost. Written systems, while consistent and reliable, are less adaptable than oral traditions that rely on memory and negotiation. You begin to see how rigidity increases as rules become fixed in text, making rapid adjustment more difficult when circumstances change unexpectedly. Society increasingly begins to operate like an early form of large-scale data system. Information about people, goods, and obligations is stored, retrieved, and managed through structured records. You notice how daily life becomes interwoven with administrative processes that quietly guide collective behavior without requiring constant direct intervention. In this organized world, visibility becomes a defining feature of social life. Actions are not only performed, but also recorded, creating layers of accountability that extend beyond immediate interaction. You sense how this changes the relationship between individuals and governing systems, as presence alone is no longer sufficient. Without documentation. As written order spreads, administrative centers become crucial nodes of control and coordination. Information flows toward these centers where it is processed, interpreted, and redistributed. You begin to understand how geography and governance become closely tied through networks of documentation that connect distant regions into unified systems. Even faraway regions begin to feel increasingly connected through shared legal and economic frameworks. You notice how written systems reduce variation between local practices, replacing diversity with standardized procedures that allow larger populations to be managed more efficiently and consistently over extended periods of time. Yet beneath this efficiency, there's a quiet reduction in flexibility across many areas of life. Oral systems once allowed rapid adaptation through negotiation and memory within communities. Written systems, while stable, require formal processes for change, creating a slower rhythm of transformation throughout society as a whole. You observe how individuals and communities gradually adjust their expectations to this new structure of written order. Instead of relying primarily on personal recollection or local agreement, they increasingly turn to written sources for confirmation. This shift changes not only governance but also how truth itself is recognized, verified, and socially validated across expanding and interconnected societies over time. In administrative archives, records accumulate steadily over generations, forming layered systems of preserved information. Each document contributes to a growing structure of collective memory that exists beyond any single individual. You imagine vast storage spaces filled with clay tablets, inscriptions, and organized records, each one capturing fragments of economic, exchange, social responsibility, and everyday life within structured historical continuity. This accumulation of written information creates a strong sense of permanence within society. Decisions made in the past continue to influence present actions through preserved documentation that remains accessible over long periods of time. You sense how time itself becomes layered within records, connecting generations through a continuous written continuity that extends far beyond individual memory. Each document carries forward the weight of earlier choices, shaping how present societies interpret and respond to new situations. You begin to notice how written records act as bridges between different eras, allowing past decisions to remain active within current systems. This creates a feeling that time is no longer linear, but organized through layers of preserved information. Despite its rigidity, the system provides a powerful sense of order and reliability across complex societies. People are able to depend on consistent rules and clearly documented procedures when making decisions. You observe how this structure reduces uncertainty, allowing large populations to coordinate their actions with greater confidence and stability. Over extended periods of time, as a result, predictability becomes one of the defining characteristics of this recorded and structured world. Individuals begin to trust systems more than personal memory or informal agreement. You notice how this growing reliance on documentation shapes not only governance, but also everyday expectations, creating a society that values consistency, clarity, and written confirmation above all else. And as this chapter closes, you begin to see the broader pattern emerging with clarity. When written systems expand across entire regions, They create stability and coherence on an unprecedented scale. In doing so, they also transform society into a structured system of recorded order that quietly reshapes how life itself is organized. You begin to notice how writing no longer belongs to isolated regions or separate cultures, but starts to connect distant societies into a shared administrative language. Through written symbols, different communities find a common structure for communication, even when their spoken languages remain entirely distinct from one another. You sense how writing becomes a bridge across cultural and linguistic distance. This shared system of symbols allows administrative practices to extend beyond local boundaries, connecting distant regions through standardized written communication. Governments and institutions rely on records that can be interpreted across many areas. You observe how writing gradually creates a common framework for managing people, resources, and obligations, reducing misunderstandings that once arose from oral or localized exchange between separate communities over time. As trade expands across vast territories, written records become essential for maintaining economic coordination and stability. Goods moving along long-distance routes are carefully tracked through tablets, inscriptions, and official documents. You notice how merchants and administrators depend on these records to verify transactions, ensuring continuity and trust, even when participants in exchange never meet directly or share immediate physical contact across space. Over time, cultural boundaries begin to blur within expanding administrative systems. Local traditions continue to exist, but they are increasingly organized under shared written frameworks that standardize governance and economic interaction. You sense how taxation, law, and trade procedures quietly encourage cultural blending, as written documentation creates common structures that shape behavior across regions, even when local identities remain distinct. Historical evidence from ancient Mesopotamia reveals tens of thousands of surviving clay tablets, preserved across millennia in archaeological layers. Many were discovered in cities such as Uruk, Ur, and later Assyrian archives where scribes recorded daily life with remarkable consistency. You imagine these fragments of administrative existence scattered through deep time, each tablet preserving transactions, grain distributions, legal rulings, and temple accounts in durable clay form. Within this vast archival presence, you realize that some spoken languages have disappeared entirely while their written symbols endure. Languages such as Akkadian and Sumerian eventually faded from daily speech, yet their cuneiform inscriptions remain preserved on clay. It feels like hearing echoes of civilizations through silent records where meaning survives not in voices, but in carefully pressed wedge-shaped marks that outlast their speakers. You begin to understand that civilization itself is increasingly taking the form of a continuous, expanding record. Rather than being defined solely by lived experience or oral memory, it becomes structured through accumulated documentation across generations. Administrative systems connect distant regions through written continuity, creating a layered historical flow where every recorded action contributes to a larger unfolding archive of human activity. Memory, once held entirely within human minds, and shared through storytelling, begins to shift into physical form. Clay tablets, inscriptions, and written records start to carry the burden of remembering for entire communities. You sense how this externalization of memory changes human relationships with the past, as remembrance becomes less fluid and more dependent on preserved physical artifacts that endure beyond individuals. As administrative systems grow more complex, writing becomes essential to maintaining coherence across vast territories. Decisions about grain distribution, labor obligations, and temple offerings are standardized through documentation. You notice how governance becomes increasingly dependent on scribes who interpret and maintain records, ensuring continuity between generations while gradually centralizing control over how information is preserved and understood. And as this transformation continues, you begin to see a deeper pattern forming beneath it all. Civilizations no longer exist only as living communities of people, but also as accumulated layers of recorded memory. Each generation adds another stratum to this expanding archive, where lived experience and written documentation intertwine, shaping a long continuity that quietly defines how human history is remembered and preserved. Even identity begins to be shaped by what is preserved rather than what is remembered. Communities are defined not only by shared stories but by the records they leave behind. You notice how documentation slowly becomes a substitute for lived continuity, subtly redefining belonging through what is officially recorded instead of what is collectively recalled in daily life. In this expanding system, written clay becomes more than a simple medium of communication. It transforms into a carrier of time itself, preserving fragments of existence that outlast the individuals who created them. You imagine each tablet as a small container of preserved reality, holding traces of decisions, exchanges, and human activity long after their original moment has passed. Trade networks grow increasingly complex as written systems allow coordination across vast distances and diverse communities. Agreements can now be maintained even when participants never meet in person. You sense how trust is gradually transferred from personal memory and oral assurance to physical records that serve as stable references for economic and social interaction over time. As administrative systems expand, cultural practices begin to align more closely with written structures. Rituals, laws, and exchanges are increasingly recorded, forming shared frameworks that extend across multiple regions. This creates a stronger sense of unity, yet also introduces a subtle reduction in local variation, as standardized documentation slowly shapes how societies organize meaning and practice. You observe how written systems allow civilizations to merge into larger organizational forms that transcend local boundaries. Different groups begin to function under shared bureaucratic logic, even while maintaining distinct cultural identities. It feels like many streams gradually converging into a single slow-moving river of documentation that carries information, authority, and continuity across expanding territories. Despite this growing integration, there is also a quiet fading of older forms of expression. Oral traditions lose dominance as written records become more authoritative and widely trusted. You sense how something flexible, adaptive, and deeply human is gradually replaced by something permanent, structured, and reliable, yet less responsive to the immediacy of lived experience. Civilization at this stage resembles a vast and continuously expanding archive of itself. Every interaction, agreement, and exchange carries the potential to become part of a long-term record. You notice how life itself increasingly contributes to a persistent documentary flow, where human activity is not only experienced in the moment but also preserved within an ever-growing system of written memory. And as this chapter gently concludes, you begin to recognize the emerging pattern. When systems of writing persist over long periods, they do not only preserve civilization, they gradually transform it into a living archive of itself, where memory exists more in objects than in people until even the echoes of language remain etched in clay. You begin to notice that the systems once built to organize memory and authority are now carrying a different weight. What once felt like clarity gradually transforms into accumulation. Records multiply across regions, and the structures designed to stabilize society begin to feel increasingly difficult to maintain as layers of documentation build up over extended periods of time. As external pressures grow and internal complexity increases, administrative systems expand beyond their original simplicity. You observe how more rules, more records, and more layers of oversight are introduced in response to earlier challenges. Yet instead of creating clarity, this continuous expansion slowly introduces strain into the system itself, making coordination heavier and more difficult across interconnected regions. The control of collective memory, once carefully maintained through structured record-keeping, becomes harder to sustain. Information spreads across too many channels, and the effort required to keep it aligned increases steadily over time. You sense how even well-organized systems begin to lose precision when they expand beyond the scale for which they were originally designed. Historical patterns show that many empires experienced gradual fragmentation or collapse partly due to administrative overload. You imagine vast bureaucracies struggling to coordinate information across distant regions, where delays, inconsistencies, and miscommunication slowly weaken structural integrity. What once ensured stability becomes, over time, a source of internal friction and systemic fatigue. As these pressures accumulate, you begin to understand that complexity itself becomes a form of burden. Systems that were designed to manage order start to generate additional demands simply to maintain their own coherence. You sense how governance, memory, and control become increasingly difficult to separate as the structure stretches beyond sustainable limits. Over time, information begins to disperse unevenly across regions. Different areas start holding slightly different versions of the same records, and synchronization becomes increasingly difficult to maintain. You notice how unity of documentation, once a major source of administrative strength, gradually turns into a fragile point of tension within the system, revealing small but growing inconsistencies in shared understanding. Power itself does not disappear suddenly or dramatically. Instead, it begins to weaken gradually, like a structure slowly losing tension across multiple interconnected points. You observe how authority continues to function in daily operations, but with diminishing efficiency as the mechanisms that once supported it become less responsive and increasingly strained under expanding complexity. The entire system feels as though it is slowly losing internal connection between its parts. Administrative centers still exist and operate, but their coordination becomes less consistent and more fragmented over time. You sense a quiet separation forming, where once unified structures begin to drift apart without a single moment of rupture or visible breakdown. You realize that this process is not a dramatic collapse, but a gradual unraveling of accumulated systems. Structures that once felt solid, stable, and reliable now require increasing effort simply to maintain basic coherence. Each correction made to preserve order creates new layers of complexity, gradually adding to the overall weight already carried by the system. Communication between distant regions becomes slower, less precise, and increasingly unreliable. Written messages that once unified decisions across large territories now arrive delayed, incomplete, or subtly misinterpreted. You notice how distance begins to affect not only physical geography, but also the coherence of shared understanding and coordinated action across the entire system. As this fragmentation continues, you begin to understand that stability was never permanent, but dependent on continuous alignment. When that alignment weakens, even slowly, the system begins to drift into partial disconnection. You sense how governance still exists but now operates in scattered form, where unity is replaced by overlapping and imperfect layers of control. As these changes accumulate, the authority of centralized control begins to soften gradually. It is not replaced immediately, but it becomes less absolute in practice. You sense how people start to rely more on local interpretation rather than distant administrative directives, adjusting decisions according to immediate context rather than strictly following unified written commands from central institutions over time. In this evolving environment, written systems still exist and continue to function, but their influence becomes increasingly uneven across regions. Some areas maintain strong adherence to official records while others gradually drift toward localized practices and interpretations. You observe how uniformity slowly gives way to variation again, as the balance between centralized documentation and local decision-making begins to shift subtly. The structure that once held collective memory in tight and consistent order now begins to loosen. You feel as though the system is no longer fully synchronized with itself across different regions and institutions. Records still exist and are actively used, but their consistency becomes increasingly difficult to preserve across both physical distance and the passage of time. Even within administrative centers, the effort required to maintain order grows, noticeably over time. You imagine scribes and officials working continuously to reconcile differences between documents, attempting to keep a complex system intact. Their work becomes less about expansion and more about correction, as inconsistencies accumulate faster than they can be fully resolved or standardized. There is a quiet irony in how systems designed to create stability can become sources of strain when they expand too far. You sense how the very tools that once strengthened governance begin to contribute to gradual fragmentation under their own accumulated weight. Efficiency turns into complexity, and complexity slowly begins to challenge the coherence it was meant to preserve. You begin to understand that control over memory is not permanent or self-sustaining. It depends not only on initial creation, but also on continuous maintenance and correction. When the effort required for maintenance exceeds the system's capacity, even the most structured forms of order begin to weaken from within, without any sudden or visible collapse. As this slow unraveling continues, the system does not disappear entirely, but instead transforms into something more dispersed and less centralized. You notice how fragments of authority remain active in different regions, even as overall coherence gradually fades over time. Order still exists, but it is no longer unified in the same stable and centralized form as before. And as this chapter gently closes, you begin to sense a deeper transition unfolding beneath the surface. When large systems of recorded control begin to fragment, memory does not disappear or end. Instead, it slowly returns to individuals, shifting away from centralized structures and flowing back into human experience, where it originally emerged and was first carried.
You begin to see the full arc of everything that has unfolded, as if standing at a quiet distance from the long river of time. Memory, once held within communities, gradually becomes structured into systems and then slowly disperses again. As those systems expand, strain, and soften under their own accumulated weight across long stretches of historical development. Across all the worlds you have moved through, one pattern remains steady and unbroken. Power is always closely tied to how information is stored, remembered, and shared within society. Whether through voice, writing, or archives, the control of memory quietly shapes the structure of governance, identity, and coordination in every civilization you have observed throughout time. You notice a repeating rhythm across history, almost like a breath that civilization itself continuously takes and releases. First, there is concentration, where memory is gathered into shared and structured forms. Then, there is control, where systems define what is preserved and what is excluded. Finally, there is gradual fragmentation, where those systems begin to loosen and drift apart again. It becomes clear that this is not a single event, but a recurring cycle that appears in different forms across different eras. Each civilization builds its own structure of memory, believing it to be stable and enduring, yet time slowly reshapes it from within. This transformation happens without sudden rupture, but through continuous internal adjustment. What once seemed permanent is revealed to be temporary organization maintained by constant effort and alignment. Even the most advanced systems of record-keeping depend on ongoing maintenance to remain coherent. You begin to understand that stability is not a fixed state, but a temporary balance between structure, complexity, and the limits of control. And as this understanding settles, you see that history itself is shaped by this rhythm of memory. Each rise and decline is not isolated, but part of a larger pattern of gathering, organizing, and releasing information. Civilization continues to move through this cycle, quietly repeating it in different forms across time. You begin to understand a deeper philosophical truth emerging beneath all these changes. Every civilization is shaped not only by what it builds, but by how it remembers what it builds. Memory is an active force, continuously shaping how societies interpret reality, structure meaning, and organize their understanding of existence over time. In your mind, Images begin to form of countless fragments drifting across time. Pieces of stories, records, and voices move slowly like water, never fully stopping and never becoming fixed in one form. Each fragment carries traces of meaning, even when separated from context, as if memory resists confinement or final resolution. There is no final conclusion that settles everything into a single definitive answer. Instead, what remains is a continuous unfolding process, where systems rise and soften and memory shifts form without ever truly disappearing. The absence of resolution feels intentional, almost as if nature itself prefers ongoing movement over closure or permanent completion. You realize that history does not move toward a single endpoint or final destination. Instead, it moves through repeating patterns of organization and release, structure and dissolution, continually returning to the question of how humans choose to hold on to, interpret, and preserve their collective past. Across changing circumstances and evolving societies, even empires, no matter how vast, powerful, or carefully organized they may appear, exist within this wider flow of historical continuity. Their records, laws, and archives are temporary arrangements within a much larger system of remembering. You begin to see them not as ultimate endpoints, but as moments within a longer unfolding process of memory. And as this understanding settles within you, everything begins to feel less like a linear story and more like a living rhythm. Civilization is no longer seen as a sequence of isolated rises and falls, but as an ongoing interaction between memory and time, where every structure is both an expression and a transformation of what came before. There is a quiet softness in this realization. Nothing feels final or absolute. Instead, everything feels connected through gradual transformation, as if time itself is gently rewriting reality without erasing what came before. You sense continuity beneath change, where every shift preserves traces of earlier forms within the unfolding movement of history. You imagine memory as something that never truly rests or disappears completely. Even when systems collapse, weaken, or fade, traces of them remain within people, landscapes, and the subtle ways societies continue to organize experience afterward. You begin to see memory as something distributed, lingering across generations rather than confined to any single structure. The world around you feels less like a sequence of separate events and more like a layered accumulation of remembering. Each layer overlaps the previous one, creating depth rather than replacement. You notice how continuity emerges through accumulation, where nothing is fully erased, and every moment leaves behind echoes that persist within later forms of experience. As you observe this long unfolding pattern, you begin to feel that human history is less about control and more about adaptation over time. Each system of memory is an attempt to hold something that is always moving, always changing, and never fully contained. You sense how stability is always temporary, shaped by ongoing adjustment. And in this quiet understanding, everything begins to feel interconnected through a shared process of transformation. Memory, time, and society are no longer separate forces, but parts of the same continuous movement. You realize that what endures is not fixed structure, but the ongoing act of remembering itself across shifting forms. There is a quiet comfort in this perspective. Even fragmentation does not mean disappearance, but redistribution, where memory finds new forms, carriers, and ways of continuing its slow movement. And as this final chapter settles, you feel the journey easing into stillness, a soft transition into ongoing presence beyond structures, empires, and control. In this final silence, everything becomes light and unforced. You understand that memory was never confined to systems alone, but always lived within the flow of time itself, moving quietly through generations like an unseen current that never truly stops. And as you drift into this quiet conclusion, you feel the final truth of the journey. Civilizations may rise and fall, but memory continues to move gently forward. And even in darkness, it remains softly alive, carrying history forward without needing to announce its presence. The script comes to a close. Thank you all for listening.